Hey guys, Anki Jeff here with part two of three of Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence by Alex Bernson. This is his interview that he talks about the book. I highly recommend reading this book. It is fantastic. I read it 3 times. It doesn't talk about the benefits of marijuana, if there are any. If it makes somebody in pain numb, wonderful. Well, that's not a big stretch. I mean, a glass of Chardonnay probably do the same thing. This talks about specifically the negatives about marijuana and why it's being pushed so hard to be legal. It's not just being pushed by governments as far as tax revenue, it's being pushed by the media. Okay, the media is pushing it very hard. And he gets into the reasons for that. So this is part two of three, he's talking with this board called the Heritage Foundation. And let's get back into it, part two of three. Like and subscribe, leave a comment for the very end, if you would, please.
Obviously, it's not a good thing in any setting, and it's not a good thing when you're behind the wheel of a 2-ton car or 20-ton truck. At the same time, there's some evidence that marijuana and alcohol are synergistic, so that people who have a couple of drinks and might be okay to drive, not great to drive, but okay to drive, if they then use cannabis, perhaps under the mistaken assumption that it won't hurt their driving, it winds up hurting their driving. In any case, the real world numbers are clear. In Colorado, there were 58 deaths in which people had cannabis or THC in their blood, fatal accidents, in, I believe, 2013. In 2017, there were 139. That's an increase of about 250%, a little bit less. 150%, a 2.5x increase post-legalization. We don't have great data nationally because we don't have great drug testing for fatal accidents nationally, but that all by itself is a striking number. Why haven't you heard that number? Because the Denver Post doesn't like writing about the problems that cannabis causes, because the Washington Post doesn't like writing about the problems that cannabis causes, because the Los Angeles Times doesn't like writing about the problems cannabis causes, because NPR won't even have me on to debate my book, okay? You haven't heard about it because you haven't heard about it, but it's a real number, and it's from it's from the state of Colorado's report on marijuana's impacts, and all I can tell you is now you've heard it, but a lot of other people haven't.
So this guy, like I said, it laments the point very, very many times. He's not a conservative. He's not some prude. He's a left-leaning guy. He worked for New York Times for years. He would not label himself a liberal or a conservative. But he can't get left-leaning networks to even come allow him to talk about this book, which is scary because, it's free speech and stuff like that is all supposed to be tenets of liberalism. But get back into it.
One last question, and then I'm going to offer the audience the opportunity to ask questions. Last year, an estimated 70,000 people overdosed and died from one opioid. It's been described as an epidemic. It also has been described as a metastatic cancer, and the latter, I think, probably is a more accurate description. Should we legalize marijuana as an alternative painkiller for acute or chronic pain to deal with this problem so that we get people smoking marijuana rather than using opioids?
So unfortunately, there's a lot of hope that marijuana can work as an alternative painkiller to opioids. There's effectively no evidence that marijuana works in chronic pain, even though the National Academy of Medicine said that it did, and even though there's a meta-analysis published in JAMA from 2015 that said it did. Unfortunately, there is significant more recent data that contradicts that. Studies conducted by the same company that's conducted the original studies that are quoted in JAMA and in the National Academy report. That's why, by the way, and I'm sure everyone in this room can imagine the market for a non-opioid painkiller that was effective. It would be in the billions, possibly the tens of billions of dollars. And there's a company called GW Pharma. It's a serious pharmaceutical company based in Britain. It's the company that makes Epidiolex, which is the CBD drug for epilepsy that's been approved by the FDA, work for chronic pain. As far as I can tell, and I've looked, there's only ever been one study comparing a THC product, a THC analog called Navalone, in this case, to any opioid painkiller. So when you hear that cannabis works in pain, the studies are almost all against placebo, which is barely ethical anyway, because we have painkillers that work. And I'm not just talking about opioids. Tylenol is ibuprofen is a painkiller. Aspirin is a painkiller. In general, cannabis has not been tested against active comparators in clinical trials, either smoked cannabis or THC. In one trial, I think it was about 10 years ago, Nabalone, which is a stronger synthetic THC analog, meaning a drug that affects your brain the way THC does, but more powerfully, was tested against an opioid called dihydrocodeine, which is actually a weak opioid. Dihydrocodeine was stronger in a statistically significant way than Nabalone. Cannabis doesn't work for chronic pain. It's actually kind of surprising to me that it doesn't work for chronic pain, because alcohol sort of works for chronic pain, or at least works in the short term for pain a little bit. It's a little bit of an analgesic, but the evidence is that cannabis actually doesn't. I don't know why that is, and I wish it weren't true. I wish that we could tell people who are using opioids to use cannabis, because cannabis, obviously doesn't carry the same risk of overdose and death as opioids. But the clinical trials and a big Australian study that came out last year called the POINT study all show the same thing, which is that cannabis is not an effective substitute for opioids in pain. And I think we'll see, but I think at some point somebody's going to do a new meta-analysis. And unfortunately, we'll see what they find. But it would be hard for me to believe, given the null results on the newer studies, that they're going to find that cannabis works for pain. So it's unfortunately not a solution. It's a problem, and it sounds like a good solution, but it's not a solution.
I'll now take questions from the audience. Let me just say the ground rules. First, please identify yourself by name and organization, and please ask a question, and making a speech, and then at the end saying, "Do you agree with me?" is not a question, okay? And also try to keep it brief so we can get as many, as we possibly can. Sir, you in the gray, you'll be next.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Aside from our current president, who seems like substance abuse or usage has never been an issue, our previous three most recent presidents all acknowledged some degree of substance abuse or use. I was curious, what kind of influence do you think that has on our U.S. society? And one thing in particular, I met one of Bill Clinton's classmates from Oxford who said it was technically true. He didn't inhale, but he said they used it in brownies, which actually had a more potent, powerful effect than if he had smoked it.
That's a good question. I think probably that encourages people to think of use as not particularly harmful. And let's be honest, most people can use cannabis and not suffer psychosis. And even if they, for that minority of people who have a psychotic episode, most people aren't going to develop schizophrenia. But most people can use cocaine once and not become addicted, right? If 20 or 25% of people who use once become addicted, that means 75 or 80% don't become addicted after one use. That doesn't mean we should be encouraging the use of any of this stuff. It means that we need to figure out what to do to discourage use and what to do with people who are going to, wind up using, whether or not we like it. Pretending that cannabis is medicine is both the greatest tactical move the industry ever made and advocates ever made, and a disaster for U.S. public health. And that's had way more impact, I think, than whether or not Bill Clinton did or didn't inhale, or Barack Obama was was a smoker.
Hi, my name is Carlos Savillon. I'm an economist, a journalist. You said that 65% of the population, and I saw that poll last year that said that they thought there was no harm with marijuana, and you blame it on the liberal press. And sure, I've seen a lot of articles in that direction, but the thing is that the lower you go in ages, let's say teenagers or 20-somethings, the higher the percentage of thinking that there's no harm. And that group of young people are little influenced by the press because they're not into reading much about politics or whatever. So how did such a high percentage of perhaps 80% of teenagers get to think that there's no harm? And I
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure I would agree that millennials are not interested in politics or reading the media. They seem pretty interested in it right now to me. I mean, I think in general, young people, look, you get older and you see the harms that drugs can cause in your own life and in other people's lives. And so you become more wary of them. I think that's very natural. What's interesting is that the number of people who use cannabis in a year has not risen that much in the US. Okay, so it was about 25 million in 2005, and it's about 40 million in 2017, the number of people used once. Okay, it's not alcohol. People do not use it every day. I mean, a lot of people do. I'm sorry, a lot of people are not using it. Okay, 85% of the country, adults did not use in 2017. People are getting their information about this from the media. And beyond that, I think there's it's fascinating to me because I've heard from a lot of users since the book came out. And even people who, sometimes they'll say, I had a bad experience, or I really felt myself kind of sliding into trouble with this, and I didn't connect it to the drug, or I thought it was just me. When a whole culture is telling you this is not dangerous, this can be helpful for your depression, and you use it, and like any intoxicant, in the 3 hours or 6 hours that you're intoxicated, you feel a little bit better. Then, you wake up the next morning, you feel worse again, and you feel worse than you did the day before. You would think that making that connection would be relatively easy. But when people are being gaslit by a whole culture, it's hard for them. And when one of the effects of the drug is to sort of impair your ability to see your own relationship with the world, it becomes even harder. So the people who understand the drug the best have a real problem seeing its effects. And then sometimes they wake up and they do. And I've heard from some of those people. But it's not surprising to me that a lot, that support is highest among the young.
And of course, when you're younger, you also feel invulnerable. You feel invincible. So anything that you're doing that could be considered negative against you or harmful, if someone tells you, hey, I heard this stuff is actually not that bad for you, of course you're going to grasp onto that. Because when we're younger, we're 10 feet tall and bulletproof. Also, it's worth noting not to confuse THC with CBD. THC, of course, is the harmful part of marijuana that causes the intoxication, causes the high. Okay, CBD is found and extracted from hemp, which is a direct relative of marijuana, but it's not addictive and it's not harmful. So that's why you see a lot of people with the CBD oil, CBD cream, things of that nature. That's actually that actually does have a benefit. And he mentions that in the book also. Again, I highly recommend you get a copy of the book. Go to eBay. It's $5-6. You can get a used copy of it. But let's get back into it. This is really getting interesting.
That's always been true. And as the baseline increases, the baseline among young users is going to increase too.
Right here in front. But we'll bring a mic to you.
Yeah, my name is Steve Alm. I'm a retired judge from Hawaii and creator of Hope Probation. One digression, if anyone here hasn't read Mr. Berenson's novels, they're the best spy thriller novels out there.
Thank you.
My question is, as you touched on it, the fact that a lot of marijuana today is so much stronger than what it was back in the 60s, 70s. How much of the problem that you're pointing to regarding psychosis and otherwise is directly related to the potency?
It's a really good question. I don't think we have a good answer for that yet. The studies on which the book is based are mostly from a period when cannabis was weaker. Most of the studies are pre-2000, certainly pre-2010, and that would suggest that this is a bigger problem. Now, advocates will say, well, really the strong stuff just means people can smoke less of it. They can titrate it a little more easily. If the evidence is as strong as it seems to be, and by the way, again, this King's College London paper that came out in Lancet Psychosis in March had a 5x risk ratio for daily use of what they called high potency cannabis, which is standard cannabis in the U.S. now. If that number is real, I think we're going to see population level impact sooner than we might think. And by the way, that will be a disaster. It will be a disaster, obviously, for users and their families, but it will be a disaster societally. The police aren't really ready to deal with it either. The short answer is we don't know.
real fast. There was a commercial on years ago when I was growing up. It was a car company called Oldsmobile, which of course is now defunct. It was closed back in the early 2000s. But there was a commercial on TV, so it was not your father's Oldsmobile. The marijuana that's being produced now is not your father's marijuana or the marijuana that was around when I was a kid back in the 80s. It's much more powerful. It's designed to be much more powerful, much more addictive. I think in the book it mentions it's up to nine, but it could be as much as 19 times more powerful than even as early as the 70s. So that's why it's so much more highly addictive.
A lot of indicators flashing red.
Can I just follow up with a personal experience in that regard? About 3 years ago, when I started getting more involved in drug policy, then I was at a conference and I listened to a professor by the name of Hoover Adger, who is the chief of pediatric medicine at Johns Hopkins Medical School and Hospital. And I asked him that question. And he said, the problem is the potency of today's marijuana is so much greater than what it was in the 60s and 70s, that studies done back then no longer afford a reliable indication of what the effect would be from people using it. And I started looking into it, and that's when I found out the potency had gone up from, say, 3% to, in some cases, 90+%, and close to 100. And I'm not a scientist, but I know that when you change the principal ingredient, that is the principal psychoactive ingredient in a substance, it's going to have a very, very different effect when it becomes more potent, and started looking into it. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people sort of got lulled into thinking this is the same old ganja that they used to smoke in college. It's not. The woman there with the brown.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm with the Addiction Policy Forum. Just one clarification. The 70,000 people who died, it's actually all drug overdoses. So it's important, I think, as we're discussing drug policy, to note that they're high across the board. Like, we've seen increases from cocaine, methamphetamine.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Just two quick questions. One, we touched upon this. Edibles, with the Denver study you cited, they accounted for 10% of the ER visits, but they actually are like such a minute part of the market.
Yes.
What do you think of this threat of edibles? And then two, do you think people are very confused over decriminalization and legalization? Because that seems to be what the issue is.
Yeah, I mean, edibles are clearly a problem, even for experienced users. It's funny, I was on a plane talking to a woman who was a polydrug user, regular cannabis user, who, by the way, told me, she said, well, I think marijuana should be legal. By the way, I probably didn't marry the guy I was dating for 5 years because he was a user. And I thought to myself, wow, this is somebody who's been sort of directly negatively affected by this, who still thinks it's fine. But so she recounted the experience of having an edible and being quasi-psychotic for 18 hours. And I think that's quite common among people who use edibles. They're just hard to titrate. And sometimes you don't know how big the dose is. And even if you should wait before taking a second dose, some people don't. So
Gummies
so
are very
real
popular
risk.
right now.
Your second question, yeah. So I think people don't understand that decriminalization versus, they don't understand what medical marijuana is. People often ask me, well, you're in favor of medical marijuana, right? Even if you're not in favor of recreational. I say the two drugs are exactly the same. And they don't understand decrim versus legalization. They don't understand that there's a way to say, you know what, we're not going to put people in jail for this. We're not even going to arrest anybody who's a user. We're just going to not have an industry promoting this. And then the third major, and by the way, both of those confusions are confusions that the marijuana lobby actively encourages. The third confusion that the marijuana lobby actively encourages is CBD versus THC. So, people now think, plenty of them, that they can actually buy marijuana at the local Rite Aid because you can go in and see a CBD product with a leaf on it. And, CBD is not THC, but people are busy and they have lots of stuff in their lives to worry about. And they think this, balm for their dog's arthritis is what their kid is upstairs smoking every morning. And that's yet another terrible thing that the industry has done, is to promote this confusion. So, sometimes I feel like I am just so busy trying to get out basic truths that, to argue any of the more complicated stuff is next to impossible.
Going to stop it there and go to part three. He brings up a very good point. Like I said, it's this confusion, I think it's a specifically implied in confusion, purposeful, is the CBD, THC. If you walk into a drugstore and you see CBD oil, what do you see on the front cover? You see a big green, looks like a marijuana leaf. Well, it's actually a hemp leaf, but they're almost exactly the same looking. So it's kind of like not truth in advertising, but the CBD oil that you're putting around on your. I used to put some on my knee before my surgery. CBD oil, CBD cream. It's not what your kid's up there smoking in his bedroom. That's like he just mentioned a point. So it's very important that we know the differences. So I'm going to cut it off there, and then we'll go to part 3, get some more questions and answers, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay. So again, like, subscribe, leave a comment at the very end. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. Let it begin with you, and say a prayer for the prayerless. So let's go ahead and end it there, and we'll go ahead and pick up in part 3.